All right, so we're going to start with 1962. So for the last couple of weeks, or for the last week, we've been learning about the civil rights movement. And I believe we started with like 1947 and, just covering different events that have occurred up to this point. So 1962, Malcolm X becomes National Minister of the Nation of Islam. So Malcolm X he was an African American, and he was quite different from other civil rights activists in different ways. So he was a member of the Nation of Islam, which he was a Muslim, and that was quite different compared to the way things were back in the day. He switched over to Islam, to the religion Islam, and he kind of like formed a Black community in which a lot of African Americans converted to Islam. So, a lot of African Americans started to kind of sway away from Christianity because they felt like Christianity was a religion or a belief that was for white people. Jesus Christ was white, blonde hair, blue eyes, something like that. And, they just they just changed. And so there was a pretty big community of followers for Malcolm X that were, Muslim, and they were African American. So Malcolm X, he had one thing that he was known for was he was different from Martin Luther King Jr. in a lot of ways. Martin Luther King Jr., we learned a little bit about him, that he was all about nonviolent resistance, civil disobedience, don't fight back, don't be aggressive. Martin Luther King was all about peaceful protest. Malcolm X is kind of the opposite. He was actually more of an aggressive, his approach was more of an aggressive approach. He encouraged Blacks to defend themselves. He actually stressed Black nationalism, in which he, encourages African Americans to take pride in their Black culture, be proud to be Black, don't try to be like whites, don't depend on whites, separate yourselves from whites, don't take anything from them in any way. And, just kind of, and he wanted Blacks to take control of their own communities. That's what he wanted. He didn't want whites like being involved with Black communities, and he didn't want Blacks trying to get help from whites. It was just like separate, figure it out, do it on your own. He wanted Blacks to get an education also. He wanted Blacks to actually, defend themselves from white brutality and things like that. And, so he was more of an aggressive approach. He was like, well, let me tell you, Martin Luther King was, if, your brother strikes you on the right cheek, you turn the left cheek and you let him strike you there. And, but you don't fight back. Malcolm X was like, well, if your brother strikes you on your right cheek, you don't turn the other left cheek so he can strike you again. You put him in his grave. You teach him a lesson. So that was Malcolm X. And a lot of people who were very loyal to Martin Luther King Jr., after years and years of just not receiving any of the things that they wanted, they started to take radical approaches and, turn to Malcolm X as their leader for civil rights. So that's what happened. All right. And let's see. Without education, you're not going anywhere in this world. Nobody can give you freedom. Nobody can give you equality or justice or anything. If you're a man, you take it. See, he was very aggressive with his approach to civil rights. That's what made these two leaders so different. They both wanted civil rights. They just had different approaches. So they meet in 1964, March 26th, which that was just the other day. That wasn't even that long ago, the anniversary of this date. I need to look for it. Okay, question 31. Which of the following best describes Malcolm X's approach to civil rights? All right, civil disobedience, militant, which means aggressive resistance, or passive resistance. So militant, I want you to think of military, like arming yourself, fighting back, defending yourself. Aggressive resistance, all right? Or you have civil disobedience, which is, to disobey a law, but be very civil about it. Don't be violent. And then passive resistance is a lot like civil disobedience. All right, so which one describes Malcolm X? The militant one. 1963, Children's Crusade in Birmingham. So, Martin Luther King Jr. demonstrated a lot of marches, but with adults and kids also joining. But, kids wanted to also kind of, participate and show that they can contribute also, but in their own way. So we had over 1,000 children. Now, I say children, but these could be teenagers, these could be high school kids as well. There were over 1,000 African Americans that decided to demonstrate their own marches. And this was in Birmingham, Alabama. And they were just peacefully protesting on the streets, but, a lot of whites. In Alabama, there was a lot of racism. And that's why there was a lot of, marches basically in Alabama. But anyways, they decided to just do this march. They're protesting racism, discrimination, things like that. And this was a crazy, this was pretty crazy. Well, there were a few marches that they demonstrated, but the police got involved and they hosed down the marchers. Here are the kids. They arrested the kids and they hosed them down with these strong, high-pressured hoses that come from like firefighters. And these are kids that they're hosing down. And they were even clubbing them with like a police club. And they had dogs attacking them, and the kids weren't doing anything. They were just peacefully marching. They weren't rioting or anything like that. So this received a lot of media coverage because people, it was to bring attention to the nation that, hey, there's a really big problem in the South, and look at the way these kids are being treated for just peacefully protesting. Like, we need to do something. Let's give them what they want. Let's give them their civil rights, right? So it was all on the news. It's pretty crazy. And I think there's probably a movie on it. All right, question 32. Why do you think the Children's Crusade received so much media attention? How was this march negatively handled? All right, so you guys should know that answer, right? I just explained it, how the children were being treated by the police for just peacefully marching, right? So go ahead and write something down for that. And like I said, I'm going to go pretty fast because it's a video recording that I'm going to post. I don't want to pause because you guys can always pause the video. Okay, 1963, there's a march on Washington. All right, so this is Washington, D.C., our capital. It was organized by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., of course. Some of you guys are familiar with this. You've seen it on TV, you've read about it, you've heard about it. I mean, everyone's familiar with it. But it was huge. It was like, I think it was the biggest rally that had ever been held in history. And all types of people went. There were over 250,000 people, over 250,000 that came. And they weren't all black. There were black, whites, there were different types of minorities, Asians, Hispanics, because this wasn't just about African Americans. This was about discrimination that was going on with everybody, all minorities. So in the, at this rally, Dr. Martin Luther King, he talks about, how African Americans are still suffering. Yes, slavery ended a long time ago in the 1800s. But it's 100 years now. It's literally 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. And they don't feel free. They still feel like they're being chained down. It's just a metaphor. But, They don't have equal rights. There's not fair justice. There's still issues with segregation. You know, nobody wants to hire blacks. There's a lot of unfairness going on right now. So so that's what he's talking about. He talks about freedoms. He talks about rights that are not fair, and then he talks about how African Americans are they cannot get ahead in life because they're not being given the opportunities that everyone else is. They're not being given a fair education. Nobody wants to hire them and give them the opportunity to work. So how can they ever move up if they're being suppressed? So he talks about all those things. This is where he gives his I Have a Dream speech. And, you know, one of the reasons why it was done right here in Washington, D.C. is so the president can hear this, can see it and hear it right outside the White House. And at the time, the president was John F. Kennedy. So John F. Kennedy, he was a Democrat, and he was definitely inspired by Martin Luther King Jr. He loved the fact that Martin Luther King was all about, you know, peaceful resistance, you know, civil disobedience, like just being calm and patient. He liked that. So as he's giving this speech, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., JFK is looking out his window, and he's watching and he's listening, and he's like, we need to do something. We need to give them what they want. They deserve it. Look at what they're doing. They're just peacefully protesting. They could be rioting. They could be tearing up this place, but they're just being civil about it, and they deserve that. So what they wanted was a civil rights act, an act that would say it's illegal to discriminate. You know, by this time, segregation was already like outlawed. It was still going on, but it was already outlawed. But it's like I said, unfair practices going on against African Americans. So I was going to show you the video, but well, you know what? Let me show you just a few minutes of it.
Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. I am happy to join with you today in what will go down as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Five score years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day Even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted. Every hill and mountain.
All right. That was a good speech. It was very emotional. I think last year when I taught it live, like to my students, I cried. The kids were like, "What is wrong with her?" Okay, so anyways, as you can tell, he's just talking about like he just dreams of, one day that like all this racism and discrimination will go away and, everyone will be seen the same and treated the same. All right, so let's go ahead and move on. So after this speech, John F. Kennedy was like, we're going to go ahead and pass the Civil Rights Act. It was something that was already being made in Congress. Congress, the lawmakers, they were already drawing it up. But of course, it has to be voted on by Congress. So it really inspired him. And he was like, I'm going to sign it. I'm going to pass it. And so this was something really big for African Americans. Okay. That's that. All right, question 33. Which of the following best describes the purpose of the March on Washington organized by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? Okay, please tell me. All right. All right, so to discuss the need for a Civil Rights Act, to protest the Vietnam War, or to protest slavery. And your answer is the first one, to discuss the need for a Civil Rights Act, because slavery was already gone, right? A long time ago. And we haven't learned about the Vietnam War yet. All right, 1963, violence in Birmingham escalates. Now, Birmingham, this is Alabama. And so from 1957 to 1963, there were 18 bombings in Birmingham, Alabama. Not done by Blacks. They were done to Blacks, different places, wherever there were African Americans. And there was this one bombing that happened actually 2 weeks after this speech was given, after the March on Washington. There was a bombing at a church, and some crazy guy put a bomb underneath the steps where you go into the church, and 4 African American girls were killed. And it was a pretty big deal. It was all over the news. And so this was 1963. 1963 is one of the worst years for civil rights. That march happened. This bombing of the 4 little girls happened. The Children's Crusade. 2 months after this, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. So it's pretty crazy. This was a crazy year. So also 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King is arrested for just leading one of his marches. Now, this isn't the first time he was arrested. Actually, he was actually arrested over 30 times during his time. Not for doing anything crazy, just marching, just protesting. So he was arrested, and this, like I said, by this time it's already like his 30th time or somewhere around there. And while he's in jail, he writes this long letter, and it gets published. And in the letter, he talks about that African Americans are growing impatient. They're getting tired of peacefully protesting. They're turning to radical ideas like following following Malcolm X. They're tired. They're frustrated, and they don't. And him being arrested, it upset a lot of people because they're like, let us do our thing. You want us to riot or do you want us to march? Which one? So, he shouldn't be arrested for doing something peacefully. And he felt like there just wasn't enough support from the white community. He had a lot of friends that were white ministers, yet why aren't they out there protesting and also trying to gain support for the Civil Rights Act? So he just talks about all these ideas, and that he said that African Americans deserve their civil rights ASAP, right now. Like, they don't need to wait anymore. Like, give it to them right now before things get worse and out of hand. And not that he supports that, but that's what could happen. Okay, so SNCC, this stands for Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. These are college students. And these are SNCC, they were also the ones who demonstrated the sit-ins, the freedom rides that you guys learned the other day. They're also doing marches and things like that. So it was one of the largest civil rights organizations in history during this time that was made up of college kids that were Black and white. Not just Black, but whites also supported the movement. All right, 1964, we have the Civil Rights Act. It's finally passed. All the protesting, everything that's been going on was all leading up to this law. So John F. Kennedy was assassinated. As you know, I just mentioned a little while ago, he was assassinated at the end of 1963, right before he can sign the Civil Rights Act. And then his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, took over. And everybody was like, is Lyndon B. Johnson going to be like John F. Kennedy? Is he going to support the Civil Rights Act? Is he going to pass one? And he did. He passed it because John F. Kennedy would have done that. And so Lyndon B. Johnson gets the credit for passing this act. And this right here prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, ethnic origin, all that stuff in employment. Like when it comes to hiring, you can't not hire someone because they're Black. It's based off of qualification. That's what it needs to be based off. And just anywhere else where there's discrimination, maybe in the housing market, anything you could think of that has to do with discrimination, that now you can sue the government or you can sue whoever because of this law, and they will have your back, basically. That's what that says. So discrimination is now illegal if it's caught. And here's Lyndon B. Johnson signing the law, signing the bill, making it go into effect, into a law. And he invited Dr. Martin Luther King there to the signing, and he signs and he gives the pin to MLK, and it was a pretty big deal. Okay, question 34. What was expressed in Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham, Alabama? So what did he express when he was arrested and he was writing that letter? He calls for African Americans to fight back because being patient and humble isn't working. Is that what he's telling African Americans to do in his letter? He asks for all his supporters to protest his arrest. Is he telling everybody, hey, come and protest my arrest? Or is he expressing frustration because African Americans are becoming impatient, waiting for their civil rights? It's the last one. He's frustrated, and he wants African Americans to receive their rights already. Okay, question 35. What is the significance, that means the importance, of the Civil Rights Act of 1964? So what did it do? It outlawed or abolished slavery. No, that was the 13th Amendment, like way back, right? It made segregation illegal in the United States, or it made discrimination illegal based on color, race, sex, and origin. Which one was it? So the one that made segregation illegal is the Brown versus the Board of Education court case. So it's the third one. It made discrimination illegal. All right, hold on. Oh, okay. Yes, I'm back. All right, question 36. Which U.S. president passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964? All right, who? Remember I said it wasn't John F. Kennedy because he was assassinated. So it was Lyndon B. Johnson, his vice president that became president. Lyndon B. Johnson. We're almost done. 1964, Dr. King is awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Now this is given, once a year, and it's given to, of course, someone who has some type of outstanding achievement, and not just for the United States, but it's a worldwide type of prize. And of course, it was because he was trying to further equality. He was doing it in a peaceful manner, and he made a lot of progress. So, and this is after the Civil Rights Act was passed. 1964, Cassius Clay wins heavyweight title. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with boxing. There's a really good movie on it. You guys should definitely watch it. I want to show it to you guys, like at the end after we take our state exam. But it's like, I'll take like 3 or 4 class periods because it's a really long movie. Anyways, Will Smith plays Cassius Clay. So Cassius Clay, I think he changed his name. Yeah, he changed his name to Muhammad Ali. He was a follower of Malcolm X, as you can see Malcolm X in the background. He converted to Islam, and he was a great African-American boxer. And this is something very symbolic because, boxing, we didn't have a lot of African-American boxers, and well, we have one that wins the heavyweight title at this time in the midst of all this chaos, right? There you go. He was actually very arrogant. Okay, 1965. Malcolm X is assassinated. All right, so he was assassinated before Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was. And this was actually done by his own people, by other Muslims. So Malcolm X, I told you he was militant. He stressed being aggressive, fighting back. But then by this time, he kind of starts to turn the other way, and he starts to kind of see where Martin Luther King Jr. is going, and he starts to see eye to eye with him, and he kind of like just started to just loosen up on those aggressive ideas. And his followers, his Muslim followers, didn't like that. They felt like he was becoming too soft. And he eventually was shot by like 5 people. I think it was 5 people. He was giving a speech, and it's also in the movie Ali with Will Smith. He was giving a speech. He goes up to the podium, and right away, like there were 5 guys in the crowd that just kind of stood up, took out a gun, and just like repeatedly shot him in front of everybody. And it was crazy. So all right, so 1965, there was a march from Selma to Montgomery. There is a movie on it. It's called Selma, also pretty good. Now this is called Bloody Sunday, so you can kind of already assume what happened. But this march right here, yes, they already got civil rights with the Civil Rights Act, but there's still other issues. Voting, that is still a problem. I did tell you guys that African Americans, and one of the other PowerPoints, African Americans had literacy tests, there were poll taxes, there were all types of things that were preventing them from practicing the 15th Amendment. So this march was a 3-day long march. And in this march, basically, they were going to go from, here's Alabama, from Montgomery to Selma, which is that's a long drive. So imagine the walk. And police came, and they came with horses. They trampled on the people. They clubbed people. That's why it's called Bloody Sunday. And it was just really, really bad. It was very violent. There were a lot of people who died. It was all over the media. And eventually, that does lead to something that they want. All right, question 37. Why did Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. organize a series of marches from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama in 1965? What was they protesting? What were they protesting? All right, they were protesting JFK's assassination. Were they protesting discrimination in the workforce? No, the Civil Rights Act got rid of that. Or were they protesting obstacles preventing Blacks from voting? So that's the last one. All right, so 1965, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is passed. Like I said, those marches were meant for something to, for a law to get rid of some of the barriers that were preventing African Americans from voting. So this only outlawed the literacy test. That's the test that people were required to take to show that they can read or write in order to vote. It's pretty messed up if you think about it. It's like, oh, if you can read this and you can pass this, then you can vote. So that made literacy tests illegal, this law. Now later on, there's an amendment that gets rid of the poll tax, but that's later on. So this is just literacy tests. And so this increases African Americans' participation in voting. This is important for the STAR because you have to know cause and effect. Because of this, now more African Americans can vote and they're encouraged to vote. And I've showed you guys a literacy test, a sample literacy test before. Question 38, what changes were made under the Voting Rights Act of 1965? It abolished the poll tax, it abolished the literacy test, or it allowed African Americans the right to vote. Which one? Oh, you know what, that's kind of confusing. So it abolished the literacy test because the 15th Amendment gave African Americans the right to vote. So abolished the literacy test. And there was also 1965 is a bad year for riots. There were tons of riots that broke out all over the country. One of the largest riots in history was in Watts, Los Angeles. And then from there, there's a lot of other riots. The red and blue, those are all the riots that happened in a few years. All right, and we're done. That is it. Make sure to keep up with your pair decks. I will be putting them in the grade book soon. Have a great day. Bye-bye.